Ladies and gentlemen, what a wonderful opportunity to be with you today. And from our Ecosystem Science and Management webinar series, this is going to conclude the series for this year. This being our December webinar, I want to welcome you and notice that my topic today is not a new one, but it's one that we continually learn about through the experiences that we have doing brush control in the state of Texas. The topic, do-it-yourself brush control equipment. That's going to reflect that I'm not really going to be talking about the chemical control of every one of the 101 species of plants that we have in our REM 1466 suggestions for control of weed and brush species on rangeland, but I'm going to be talking about some of the experiences and the equipment. It may relate to the size of your land. It may relate to the situation that you are in. As we look around Texas today, most landowners are faced with a series of growing problems, and certainly one of the problems that we've had is an increasing amount of brush. As I grew up in San Angelo, Texas, and I lived around mesquite and other brush species, uh, I want to tell you that between College Station and San Angelo, there's probably more brush in the state now than I can remember as I was growing up. So in some aspects, in some locations, the brush species are getting ahead of us. And it turns out, with the state being predominantly privately owned, that individual landowners are responsible for the plants. If they have them on the land and they really don't want them, then it's up to the individual to make a decision to do something about it. And so we have a number of brush control options. These change over time. We have an ever-changing herbicide cost, and then we have regulations that come and go related to what we can do on the land, and especially with chemicals. And then ranches, they're changing in size. And so we have a lot more of what I'll call small acreage landowners today than we once did. And so what people are able to do is affected by the property size that they have, the amount of income they have, and then the decisions they want to make for the goals that they have on their land. And in many cases, where we live, we're being encroached on by urbanization, and in some situations, urbanization reduces the options that we have for controlling brush. Not everyone's able to call in the airplane or a helicopter and come spray 10,000 acres. And a lot of times, if we're proactive, then the brush plant or brush species that we want to work on, it may be an early infestation. It may be less than 1 acre in size. So land ownership patterns are changing, and then the goals of why we own the land and what we can manage the land for profit, these are changing. So look at this first slide. The slide that I have is the title slide. This was a picture that was taken back in the early 1980s by Dr. Alan McGinty, retired extension specialist, and at that time he was at Fort Stockton, and he named this homemade spray rig that you see, he named it the Human Boom because it had 6 sets of hoses coming off of it so that 6 men could walk behind the spray rig and be spraying brush as they went through the pasture. And the picture, if you recognize this area, this is on Clayton Williams Ranch, south of Alpine, Texas. Well, there are critical steps that we must look at as we get ready to do it ourselves, brush control. And as you see on the slide, the number 1 item is I need to know the plant species, and what that implies is I need to know the name of a plant. If I look at a plant and I can't name it, then I can't look it up in a book, and the plant is only green, yellow, purple, black, orange, or red. And until I can name it, I can't go see what research and experience have put together and has been printed and made available to all of us to know what the value of the plant is, and then if we want to get rid of it, what kind of treatment would we select. So with the species, when we look at Texas, we have about 154 families of plants. And so we don't have a do it once chemical for everything that's in the state. Usually what we have in brush control is we have chemicals that are good for 3 or 4 or 5 families. Some chemicals are specific only to one family of plants. Then as I look to see what I can do to treat the plant, uh, then I have options, and we'll get into some of those options. And I want to be able to select the appropriate option that will give me the most return for my effort and my investment. The third thing is to use the proper equipment, and some equipment can be very labor intensive. Some equipment might not apply the herbicide correctly, or you might not be able to get it out at the right rate, or use that equipment at the proper time of the year. And then one thing that we look at in do-it-yourself brush control is, again, like in every use in agriculture, when we mix herbicides, that has to be done correctly, and so that each herbicide that we have comes with a label. And we find that a lot of mistakes that are made are purely made because the individual did not read everything about the label. So timing becomes an important issue. Some treatments that we can do with some chemicals and some methods, we can do them any day of the year. And then some treatments and their time are relegated to when the plant is actively growing or when it has mature leaves. Uh, and or it's like in weed control, we get our best effort before a plant goes through stem elongation or begins to flower or set seed. And then in our risk program, the number one risk is that people often believe if they go out and do a single treatment that the pests they were after will be gone forever. And usually by the time that people want to do something about a plant, they have a lot of it. And maybe it's been there for years. And so when we think about it, many of these plants set seed, and even though we use a chemical to kill the parent plant, the seed germinate later and then the problem plant returns. So with that introduction, I want to go and ask you to look at this picture, and I have a question for you that we'd like for you to respond to. The question is, in this picture, imagine that you are entering the gate to your property and this long row of woody plants is going down the fence line. I want to ask you, what method would you pick if I give you these 6 choices? The number one, individual plant treatment with a foliar spray. Number two, individual plant treatment with a stem spray. A foliar broadcast ground rig, a foliar broadcast airplane, or would you go in there and do mechanical work on this and bring in the bulldozer, or mechanical and bring in the chainsaw and start cutting these things down? In your situation, if you had this at your gate, what would you select to do about it? And Pete has provided you there with a box to mark your answer in. And I'll give you a couple of minutes to put those answers together. Pete, we're almost there. We're up to 20 responses. We'll take just another 35 or 40 seconds and then we'll move on to my next slide. And I appreciate your answer based on what you see that this woody plant situation might be doing and how you might want to treat it. So Pete is going to put all the answers together and we'll be able to see. And as I notice, one individual responded on my small scale, meaning small number of acres, they would pick number 6. But look, every answer has been picked by someone. Pete, let's go on from there, okay? And I'm going to move on to the next slide. So look, did you think about all the things I talked about in the beginning, the critical steps? Could you name that brush plant that was in the fence line? If I named it, I might be able to look it up in information provided from Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, other universities and agencies on what I could do about it. And then I have to look at myself and my time and my money and what I think the value or the lack of value that that problem is and pick equipment and then mixing the herbicide, applying the treatment, and then avoiding the single treatment approach. So, is there a single right answer, or do I need to know more about that plant and then the response I'm going to get from doing something to it? And see, there is an individual landowner preference that we see here. So, in our Brush Busters program, which has been designed to meet the needs predominantly for treating uh, individual plants, look at what Wayne Hanselka, Alan McGinty, and Daryl Eckert wrote years ago. The Common Sense Brush Control Program for Ranchers. It's calling upon you not to be looking for magic, but to use common sense and how you can go out and deal with the woody plant problem. He said it is a program to help ranchers control their own brush problems safely and effectively. And so again, safely regards the soil, the air, the water, the plants, and then the human life that is around that area. And another one said it's best described as an effective, user-friendly, do-it-yourself approach to brush control that stresses individual plant treatments to limit damage to the plants I want to save, the desirable plants, reduce treatment costs, and then improve control effectiveness. So this has been the basis of our Brush Busters program from the beginning. Now that we've looked at, all your answers are correct based on how you would want to tackle that problem. Also, how many acres would be involved. And so if that whole fence line may not be enough acreage for an airplane or a aerial broadcast treatment to be done. So in this question number 2, we would like for you to provide us with what woody plant that you are dealing with on your land at the present time is your biggest problem. And if you go down to the chat, I say, okay, so Pete has got an answer placed there for you to put in the name of the plant. Now, look, you don't have to spell it correctly. Many people don't know how to spell Wasatch correctly. They think it starts with a W, it starts with an H, but all the answers will remain anonymous. And however you spell it, if you put it in that list for us, that'll give us some idea of what the major problems that you are dealing with on the land today. I'll give you a couple of more a minute to go ahead and answer. Pete, we're up to 20 answers
Yes,
now.
can you see the answers as they're being typed?
Yes, I can see them. Mm-hmm. In a previous survey that I did up at Wichita Falls back in October, the mesquite, the prickly pear, and the cedar were still the top three, even in Wichita Falls. But of course, at that meeting, the people came from all over the state. So as I go from ranch to ranch and county to county, there are people who don't have their problem isn't mesquite, it isn't prickly pear, and it's not red berry, juniper, or ash juniper. We have an sundry of plants. Pete, there's all 30 of the answers, and we have 37. So this, don't worry about your spelling, and then Pete is going to come back to us with a summary. So as we look at these plants that you consider to be a problem in the do-it-yourself brush control equipment, we have the individual plant treatment for stem sprays, an individual plant treatment for leaf sprays. If I'm using a soil applied chemical like Picloram or Velpar, I can have a soil spot, or if I'm treating yucca, I can have a Whorl spray, and then I have broadcast liquid sprays, individual plant treatment, and broadcast pelleted herbicide applications. And then one of the most important things that we have today is our individual plant treatment using the cut stump treatment. And then lastly, uh, organic equipment. And let's look and see what that means. This is Dr. Lyons, our program unit leader in ecosystem science and management. And at the beginning of the talk that he's doing here, notice out of the back of his pickup that uh, he's showing a what appears to be a weed eater, and it has a circular saw blade on it. If you look right here, a circular saw blade, and I think, Pete, you use one of these in some of your uh, work that you do on your property. But again, it's a gasoline powered motor, and you can go up and effectively saw down woody plants that are up to 2 to 2.5 inches in diameter. But notice here, we've got the regular shovel. Some of the plants can be dug up, especially when they're young, and disposed of. And then up here in the pickup, you see the yellow shaft of an axe that has also been a long-term brush control piece of equipment. So many times, what you already have in the barn and in your possession could be brush control equipment. But when we think about these pieces of equipment, we must remember that in the state of Texas, all but the ash juniper and the eastern red cedar and maybe tassajia, when I cut them off at the ground or close to the ground, those three are the only ones that die. All the other things like poison ivy, rattan vine, grapevines, all of our woody species from mesquite and huisache and ratama to the oaks to the hackberries to the elms and the sumacs, they all sprout back from the crown. So the oldest method, look at this, organic method using a hoe. And the plant here that's being hoed up is about a 2-year-old ash juniper plant. And so again, by taking the top off of this plant with the hoe, ash juniper is going to be dead. And so even if I flat cut it when it's 20 years old, and I flat cut it with the chainsaw at the ground and the tree falls over, it's going to be dead. So this is one of the methods that we've used in the hill country and for ash juniper. But think about using the same top removal method as we see here for prickly pear. And as part of the Brush Busters program, we do have a prickly pear top removal method. And so as the individual is digging this plant up with a grubbing hoe or even a shovel, the recommendation is to cut the roots 2 to 4 inches below the surface, remove the pads and the roots from the area where you've treated this plant, and stack it up or put it in a brush pile. And some people put it in a barrel, and many prickly pear species take about 6 months to a year, and maybe up to 2 years to finally dry out. But note this last statement, that any pads that I leave in contact with the soil surface, they may take root and grow new plants. So I'm kind of seeing that if I chop the plant down, the plant could come back. If I don't remove the prickly pear pads from the pasture, then each single pad could create a new plant. But these are our methods using our physical equipment. As we move to looking at our first individual plant treatment in stem spraying, let's look at an old method that back in the 40s and 50s and up into the 60s, man would pour kerosene, diesel fuel, diesel fuel oil down on the base of a mesquite on the day that the soil pulled away from the very base of the crown of the plant, meaning it was very dry. This usually occurred in dry conditions of the summer, and using that diesel fuel and pouring it down the side of the plant and going all the way around the crown, then I could ultimately kill some of the mesquite with a chemical called diesel or fuel oil. And what you see the individual in the picture doing is he's actually spraying, I mean, he's actually doing a pour on here, and he's putting out Remedy Ultra and Diesel as a basal stem treatment, but he's using the old style type can. Well, some of you could still have those in the barn, and they may be of use today. In a program Tuesday night in Galveston, I, tongue in cheek, looked at the people and asked them if they did their brush control on Thanksgiving afternoon. You know, got out and did some exercise and kind of wore off some of the energy from all that turkey that they ate, but they all laughed because I think in Galveston County it rained that day. So good and bad and sweet. Well, many times we have pump up sprayers that we have in our barns, or we're using them in our gardening activity, and any kind of pump up sprayer uh, can be very effective as a tool, as a piece of equipment for a lot of the jobs that we do with brush on small acres. And this kind of container, the only disadvantage that I'm going to tell you that it has, there's two things. One, you have to carry that uh, pump up garden sprayer around by the handle, and then many times the the spray nozzle over here to the far right that comes on a garden sprayer may not be the right kind of nozzle for doing the job that you have in mind. So the only two disadvantages to those, otherwise under pressure they work very well. A lot today in our individual plant treatment, whether I'm doing a foliar spray or a basal stem spray, we're going to see the use of a backpack sprayer. And the backpack sprayers are made by several companies, ranging anywhere from 1 to 3 to 5 gallons. And a lot of times in our work, we're only going to be putting a couple of gallons in because each gallon weighs about 8 pounds. And the more weight you put on it, the sooner you're going to hurt your back. But these backpack sprayers, and in this case, this is a solo backpack sprayer, but these can be purchased with a diaphragm or a piston pump. And what we have found by using these is that the piston pumps always seem to have less of a leaking problem or break open and then have the herbicide running down your waistline and onto the back of your pants. And so this type of sprayer from Solo, they're resistant to diesel. So if I'm mixing Remedy Ultra and diesel in here, these are built so that the parts of the pump are not going to break down very quickly to having diesel in there. Now notice this orange aftermarket strap. This is not what comes on this backpack sprayer. We call it an aftermarket shoulder harness because These are padded with the waist belt. They help remove some of the weight of the unit off of my back and put it down on my hips and distribute that better. But one of the more useful and commonly used in brush busters equipments that we have today in our work. The other thing to be thinking about as I do an individual plant treatment and I'm looking at treating stems or the basal part of the main stem here is, what does the spray nozzle look like? Well, in this case, look at the amount of material going out in a fine mist. The target area is right here on this main stem. And so this is more of a cone-shaped fan, and when I get into working with the stem, I'm going to be using something that will put the chemical on the stem but not waste the chemical or have it drift from the site of which I'm spraying it. So we get into nozzles, and for that stem spray, if you look over in this picture to the far right, this is a ConeJet 5500 X1, and notice in the orifice right in the middle of the nozzle that the where the chemical comes out is very small. As I go up to uh, leaf sprays where I want more area to be covered at once, and I'm going to have more like a fan come out, that the hole in the or the orifice in the nozzle actually gets bigger, so that in many of my leaf sprays, I'm going to be using a ConeJet 5500 X6 up to X8. And then over here to the far left, look at the kind of nozzle that we'd be putting on for weed spraying so that we cover a lot more area. Well, this X1 over here on the far right is going to give me more control of the chemical when I'm putting it on the basal stems of a plant. So the ConeJet 5500X1 is pictured here, and notice even on the nozzle at the tip, it has an X and a 1 there. Oftentimes, as part of our equipment and selecting a spray nozzle, we're going to be using these 100 mesh screens, and not only do they filter out material that may be in the line, but they serve as a check valve so that when you're not spraying, the chemical that is in your spray wand and in your hose doesn't come out the end or doesn't back up back to the tank. So this fits inside of the unit between the nozzle and then where you screw it on to the wand that you're using. So in this picture, now I have a more adequate treatment with an X1 up to X3, and I'm going down the stem, and I'm not spraying away out in the area here and getting chemical on non-target species. So look at the distance here between the stem and where the nozzle is. And back in that other picture, where I had more of a fan type nozzle, a cone pattern going out, uh, that was about 6 to 8 inches away from the plant, and here we're about 2 to 4 inches away from the basal stem of this mesquite tree that I'm spraying. Recognize that when I go to spray, I'm going to start at the bottom and go up here 12 to 16 to 18 inches, and I'm going to have to spray all the way around the plant, especially if we get above about 1 inch in diameter and the spray does not wrap around on its own, then I have to go all the way around the stem with this kind of application and that kind of equipment. When I get into leaf spraying and I'm looking at individual plant treatment, this four-wheeler, uh, an ATV with a pump and a tank on it, and then a long hose and a wand, that seems to be used by a lot of people. As you look at the spray here in the picture, I'm trying to cover the foliage of the plant in a leaf spray, so a string nozzle with an X1 would not be the nozzle to select, But again, a lot of people on the nozzle here are selecting an X6 to an X8 so that they get a lot of coverage more quickly. So this X8 with the large orifice does provide that kind of spray job that I'm going to be looking at out in the field. And again, as the nozzles change in size, the screen with the check valve are really important. So in this picture here, I'm looking at the pad spray for Pricklypear, which is going to be very similar to my leaf spray. And if I look at the width of the spray job that I'm getting. And again, with Pricklypear, whether I'm using Surmount or I'm using Tordon 22K, I'm going to end up spraying on both sides of these pads, and I'm going to be spraying them till they glisten just before they start to have droplets go to the ground, and then the spray job there is done. Pete, I'm halfway through, and I would like to ask anyone that has a question if you would go ahead and post it in the chat box now. And I'd like to introduce James Jackson, who's also participating with us today. James is our program specialist in ecosystem science and management at Stephenville, Texas, and I've asked him to be able to answer your questions also as we look at our woody plant control equipment today. So if you have a question, uh, please provide one over there, and we'll get
Yeah,
to it as we go along. I'll give you just
it,
another 30 seconds, Pete, for them to
Ricardo
put
has
the first
questions. Is how do you
questions in.
apply the saw blades on a weed eater?
Well, on that Husqvarna, it comes with a reverse threaded bolt nut at the end, and so that one is specially made for having a saw blade put on. But what I was saying is that the unit itself looks like a weed eater, and so there are commercially available pieces of equipment that look like a weed eater, but they're actually made for holding the circular saw
And
blade on them. Again, I have to be careful. If I went to a regular electric weed eater that I would own at my house, the nut would end up coming off, and the saw blade would probably fly off and hit me in
and
the
can I
leg.
add something right quick? For I do quite a bit of stump cut
Yes.
using the apparatus like that. One thing you need is a straight shank. The curved shank, there's too much torque. The curved shanks not work, and the curved shanks you have trouble getting to the stump. And if you go to our Facebook fan page, Dr. Megan Clayton has a good video, like 3-minute video on stump cut.
On the
And
stump cut, that is correct. Now, Pete, if we look in the chat box, James Jackson is beginning to respond to some of the questions that we're getting there. And if we look, uh, what is our favorite chemical for prickly pear? Again, we do have multiple choices to pick from, and the most recent chemical put on the market for the control of prickly pear as a pad spray is the Surmount, used at 1%. And so, James, I appreciate you continuing to put answers up to those questions. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go on to my next slide, Pete. So in our leaf spray rig, a common one that people will have now. This may not be economic for the person with 1 acre, might not be economical for the person with 5 to 10 acres, but a lot of people have gone to an ATV with a 12-volt power source uh, that'll drive a uh, pump that will pump, as you see here, 1.4 to 1.8 gallons per minute. And notice on these kind of units that they have the tank size is not standard, but many sizes are available, and as suggested here, 14 to 25 gallons. I have seen an ATV like this with 4 10-gallon tanks mounted, two in the front and two on the front rack and 2 on the back rack for a total of 40 gallons that went out with the rig. What is recommended that when we do a leaf spray that we use a 3/8 inch hose, and you can see the hose coming off of the back of the rig here, uh, and that's a 3/8 inch, and kind of the size that works with the wands, that doesn't under pressure or over pressure what we're trying to do. And then the wand itself is usually going to be a poly hardened plastic spray wand. A lot of them are black. There are other colors available. And when I go into the leaf spray, my wand is going to be fitted with an X8 nozzle, meaning I'm going to get a fan to a cone-shaped wide spray due to the orifice size being larger. And again, I'm going to have the 100 mesh screen or check valve in there as protection to my equipment and then to myself. So the ATV sprayer here is rigged with 3 hoses so that there are 2 people walking along spraying the Pricklypear, and the gentleman that's driving the ATV has also got a wand in his hand. So we're getting a larger area treated when I'm doing it with the 3 wands. So look at the black arrow is going to a pressure tank. What kind of things do you have to have? Well, a lot of people, they understand how sprayers work, and this is a PVC unit that an individual made to be their own homemade pressure tank. So not everything has to be bought commercially. If you're working out in the shop and you know what you're doing, then some of these things that we have in our equipment you can make yourself. When we go to our soil applied liquid chemicals, and then and we'll look at some pelleted chemicals as well. This center picture here is showing Larry White with what appears to be a sheep drench gun, and it's metal, and it has a gauge on it up on the handle where you're able to set it at the number of milliliters that you would like to put out. And the chemical that he's using here is on the left, and the Velpar comes readily already mixed and ready to use right out of the jug. But the same thing, would I want to use Remedy as a soil applied chemical? And your answer should be no, because the Triclopyr, that is the chemical that's in Remedy Ultra, is not a soil active chemical. It's not going to be picked up by the root system of a plant like the Velpar on the left is. So the these spot guns, they vary in price, where I have this syringe type gun that some people will buy. I have the hardened, very hard plastic guns, and then like the one that Larry was carrying, I have the steel unit. These vary in price from store to store and based on the material that they're made out of. And at one time we ranked those in a price range of $12 to $80. But again, these are equipment where I'm going to be putting out an exact amount of chemical every time I pull the handles together and I trigger it. And typically, we're looking at putting out 2 to 8 milliliters of chemical mix at a time. Uh, Using the syringe type is easily attached to this bladder that we have here, and the bladder is going to hold a lot more chemical than some of the kinds of tanks that we have, or the jug itself that we have. So we have a bladder here, and notice in the bottom right picture, um, the spot gun is putting the chemical right down in a stream to the base of the plant. So within each species, and this plant that's being treated here is mesquite. If I were using Velpar, we do have a recommendation on how many milliliters of Velpar do you use per 2 different methods: the stem diameter or the width of the canopy of the plant, looking at 3-foot increments for each 2 milliliters of chemical that I'm going to put on the ground. And again, when a plant has probably been shredded and I can't look underground, we're trying to put the chemical around the base of the plant with that spot gun in several locations, as you don't really know where the root system is that's going to take up that soil active water, moves in water through the soil profile type chemical. One individual came up and said, so I don't have to bend over and hurt my back. He took syringe tubing and added it to his spot gun. And so when he's standing here using the syringe tubing, he's getting closer to exactly where he wants to put it. And notice his back, he's not bending over and overworking himself there. In looking at spraying our liquid herbicides, we see all kinds of homemade equipment all over Texas, and we see a lot of commercial equipment that is available. And so spraying liquid herbicides, I've got several things I want to show you, and that when I'm using my ATV and I'm going to be going out and spraying the herbicide, one things that we've learned about is to get an idea of how much chemical you're putting out per acre. You do have to have certain things like a pressure gauge, and we have a recommendation of 10 to 35 pounds of pressure per square inch in those things, or even a device that's very useful. Look at the bypass and valve. What if you need to turn this unit off that you've made and you need to stop the chemical from going back into the tank or going out to the hose? Then we have a bypass and a check valve there when doing broadcast spraying. Another thing for looking at and calculating how much chemical I'm putting out per acre is to have a good speedometer. A lot of our ATVs, they're more for recreation. They don't come with speedometers, but you can buy aftermarket speedometers that are needed for broadcast spraying, because I do need to be able to calculate how much chemical I'm putting out so that I meet the regulations not only enforced by the Texas Department of Agriculture, but what we have actually found in the research that's going out there. So this kind of speedometer that you see in the picture, the speedometer, an aftermarket, it costs about $260 to $350, and this is available from the Wiley Company. And that this type of speedometer is good because up here it has a white or clear screen, so that the readouts are easily visible even when I'm out working in full sunlight. So the LED display is white and clear, and the numbers that appear on this are going to be black. If I'm looking at my equipment, look at this homemade boom sprayer apparatus here. There, I'm spraying up to 9 to 10 feet on each side from the center here, but I've got a set of 3 nozzles here that are spraying down. Now, this looks like weed control equipment to me with these flat fan nozzles, but notice that the advantage is when I'm spraying down and I'm using the right kind of nozzle, I'm using a 400 to 600 size droplet that's coming out that is going to have less drift than some of the kind of nozzles and equipment that I can use. The disadvantage to this piece of equipment is if my brush is taller than 28 inches off of the ground, then my boom's going to get caught up in the vegetation that I'm trying to spray. So it has its place and can be used for brush control. A more common apparatus is the boomless nozzle that's mounted on the back of this ATV, and a lot of ATVs, when you buy the pump system, it's standard on most ATV sprayers. But this one with a single nozzle right here, that you see pictured up here, so you're not spraying the equipment. It's only coming out in about 160 degrees of the circle. This Field Jet KLC9 boomless nozzle is going to be spraying a swath width of about 15 feet. And it actually is run with a 1.8 gallon per minute pump. And so the boomless nozzle, generally, if I buy it from Wiley, it's about $35 to $40, and others that are made are going to cost less or even cost more. The Boom Jet 5880 is commonly used, and it's a boomless nozzle, but look at, just like the one we were looking at, this one has 5 nozzles that are coming out of it, putting out my brush control spray, and this one's going to go up to a 30-foot swath. And so from the center of the unit, I'm going to be spraying out with this unit 15 feet on each side. So even in some of our grasshopper work, this kind of nozzle setup and swath would be used. But as I have more nozzles to pump to, this one has been shown to require about a 3.7 gallon per minute pump, and that size pump costs anywhere from $100 to $150. And then the nozzles themselves that you see on the unit, those cost about $150 to $180, depending on where I purchase those. So each one of these setups, it's got a different cost. It depends on where you live and where you're willing to buy it from, and is it on the internet or is it at your local store. So in our broadcast spray, the basic rules of thumb on whatever equipment that I'm picking here is I'm trying to use 20 to 30 pounds of pressure per square inch, and I'm using 10 to 30 gallons of product per acre. And the last note is we need to be able to calibrate that, and we do have an AgriLife extension publication on how to calibrate, a very neat 3-step method that you can also get at the AgriLife bookstore for free. And so the things that we don't recommend are the things that, like these mist blowers, that produce a very fine uh, particle size that is more likely to drift. Some of this equipment, like you see here, might be used in the pecan industry, but we don't recommend it when we're doing things with brush control. So we say be aware of those blowers. And for some chemicals, they're prohibited on the label for putting that chemical out. Accurate measuring containers. How many times has it been like cooking lasagna and it's a pinch of this and a pinch of that? Well, our chemicals are most effectively put out, and you get the best return on the results when you follow what's written in the label and written in our chemical recommendations for brush control in Texas. So we want to use the right equipment, and a lot of these can just be made out of plastic or Nalgene to use it. And in some jobs, some of you got 100 acres you want to spray, and the 25-gallon tank, you might get tired of coming back in and filling up every 30 minutes. And so what is shown here is a piece of equipment that you might consider is putting in nurse tanks that are going to end up feeding more chemical through the time and the process that we're at. Always, for safety, when we're mixing our chemicals, notice that we've got chemical uh, repellent type gloves on. This individual is wearing a hat, wearing eye protection, and cotton clothing in this case. So we don't want to get this, and even the blue highlight dye, which helps mark the plants so that we can see them for a day or two and not repeat spraying the same plant. The highlight dye takes days to get off of you if you get it on. In our world of pelleted herbicides, let's look at see some of the things. Here, tebuthyron comes in a product called Spike 20P, and this is a dispensing unit for putting out a tablespoon or an ounce of the pellets, depending upon what you're treating. Over here in the picture, it's shown that when we put out the pellets, we're wearing gloves. We still have eye protection, and notice he's holding the canister that the pellets come in is carried upside down so that when you push the trigger up here to get the pellets, they fall into your hand, and then you throw them up under the area of the plant where the root zone is going to be, and that pellet dissolves in rain and the chemical is picked up. So these kind of methods um, are used with our pelleted herbicides, and we have two main pelleted herbicides that are still being used today. Others have been put into pellets. We used to have grid balls from Dow AgroSciences for putting out some chemicals, but the spike container that carries about 5 pounds. And if I'm doing a broadcast method from an airplane, I'm going to be putting out 3.75 pounds to the acre. So you can quickly see that you're going to be treating 2 to less acres if you were using that canister in a broadcast mode. So look at the whirlybird. It looks like a whirlybird in the top left picture of planting grass seed or broadcasting fertilizer. With the tebuthyrone 20p pellets, an air blast gun here in the top right was made, and with the kind of wand that it had in a broadcast application, if I took the wand and went back and forth with it, I could end up putting out pellets about 30 feet on each side of me. And again, the tebuthyrone pellets are excellent when I'm thinking about Yopon, I'm thinking about whitebrush, but there's many of our woody plants that that chemical's not going to control, but it will get all the oaks, the elms, and the hackberries, so you have to be careful. Are there non-target plants out here because the selection of a soil-applied pellet may not be the way you want to go. So in our Brush Busters cut stump treatment, going all the way back to the beginning of the presentation, some ranchers want to cut down their woody plants for aesthetic reasons, haul them off, get them out of the way quickly. We always have to remember that most of our woody plants in Texas have sprouting ability, and that new stems arise from the dormant basal buds, the exceptions being the blueberry or ash juniper and the eastern red cedar. And these sprouts can grow rapidly because of the large root volume and stored reserves that are still alive, that the sprouts can come up and have more stems and become a bigger problem than what you started with. So in our cut stump treatment, you went out and you sawed it down. And look at this bottom right picture. You left a stump. You're cutting it as close to the ground as you can, but you're not cutting into the soil. And here at this whatever method of cutting that I'm using, I'm going to be, in this case, in the cut stump treatment of Brush Busters, I'm going to be using 15% Remedy and 85% diesel or a vegetable oil. So the cut stump, the key is not the equipment. The here is that that stump needs to be treated within seconds to minutes after I cut the stump. The stump will start to heal over like a scab on you will start to heal a wound, and then the chemical will not be taken up by the vascular system of the plant. When I go in to spray the chemical, I'm also going to be spraying this outer bark, and then I'm going to be spraying the surface. Now, one of the hazards here is if my way of cutting this stump gets litter, leaves, and soil up on top of the stump before I spray it, I'm going to have to clean it off. So I want to adjust my nozzle on my backpack sprayer or my ATV if I come by to spray these stumps. I want a very coarse mist in a cone-shaped pattern so that I get a good cover of that stump. And I'm going to spray 1 to 2 inches away from the surface of the stump, not a couple of feet. And I spray until that stump becomes wet on the surface. So here's examples of the 2 to 3 inches of spraying the stump. And again, look over on the right how close I'm spraying. Now, you'll always know if you didn't treat that stump right because you'll end up getting sprouts coming off of that cut stump. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's only up to your imagination on what kind of equipment that you can be using that get the chemical out correctly at the correct time of year and the correct volume to get a treatment that's going to give you the bang for the buck. And these pictures here are showing some homemade equipment, and this is this is called the pear buster and or the pear crusher, and this is a device that Pat Hemphill built, a rancher, that when he went by, he had this boom on the front. It sprayed the prickly pear with the prickly pear chemical, and then this roller came over and chopped it up. And from this work that he did, he is saying that he is getting excellent control, combining the chopping of the pads up with putting the chemical out. Well, ladies and gentlemen, James, I want to thank you for answering the questions as I kept talking for 55 minutes. But, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for participating in our December webinar. And note that the moon is still out, and watch for deer on the highway if you're driving at nighttime. And have a wonderful holiday season. And we look forward to having you back on our Ecosystem Science and Management webinar series for next
Yes,
year.
thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Barron. Again, if you were here for a CU credit, please put in your email address. Any other questions, please feel free to type them out. Dr. Barron will be glad to answer it. Looks like they're asking you to be available. Yes, this webinar is going to be recorded. Will be posted on the website, Natural Resource Webinar website. So anyway, with that and said and done, Dr. Barron mentioned about the webinar series. Our next session is going to be on January 7th, 2016. Timing of weed control, is it worth it? It'll be 1 IPM CEU. Again, I know earlier they asked about the how to attach the saw blade. If you follow us on Facebook, on our educational page is facebook.com/txrange. If you scroll down to the bottom of the videos, you will see one about Dr. Clayton on stump cut and spraying. You should be getting a pop up on your link on the please answer the survey. It'll help us, and I'll go ahead and type it in on the chat box as well, so y'all can click on it and go to it.